Apologetics Center, there's a table set up in the back, and what I'd like you to do is pick up some of the free materials. This is a little material on the purpose of the Warren Christian Apologetics Center, what it's all about. I've got some of my books there. The book is presently being used as a textbook at West Virginia School of Preaching, at Bear Valley, Florida School of Preaching. I think probably Tri-Cities is looking at it. I know that Memphis has access to it. Harding University is using this as a text in their apologetics classes. Some others are as well. It's being taken around the world, actually. This is the first book of its type in the Brotherhood, actually. In the first book on apologetics that's this detailed and this, not because I wrote it, but because it's nobody's bothered to do it before. And it's got information in there that's very helpful. It's not bedside reading, it's philosophy, and if you deal with philosophy, someone once said you can read a sentence or two and chew on it for hours, and that's probably true. But so it's one that's going to challenge you, but it's well worth your time if you're willing to be challenged and learn some things. We had a debate not too long ago, Adversarial Dialogue is the way it was titled, but in fact it was a debate with a man who denies that Jesus ever lived at all. And the outcrop of that was the case for the Christ of the New Testament, just published. There are 4 disputants there. I'm one of them. I was the moderator for the whole program and the question and answer session following, and then I wrote the final chapter to respond to each of the other 3 gentlemen that participated in this. And so mine is the last chapter in this one. If you'd like to have this, I've got some of these on the display table as well. So that's the commercials. Now what my job is in this discussion, in this format, is to discuss the whole process of organic or general or macro evolution. I'll define those terms for you in just a moment. But people have some very unsophisticated ideas about evolution, and some people have some very sophisticated ideas about evolution. I want to help at least kind of bring it maybe more clearly into focus, show you what it is and what it isn't, and why it does not occur. And there's a strong disjunction between creation and evolution. And there's either a supernatural cause for the universe, David handled that in this last hour, or there's a natural cause. Those are the only 2 possibilities. There's another one, it's pantheism, but that's not one that I'm going to entertain seriously. So the universe was either naturalistically caused and purely by natural means, or it was caused by supernatural entities. And so if you eliminate the natural, which we're going to do in this one, you also will make an argument for a case for God's existence. And I'm going to do that as well. So we've got a lot of material to cover and pretty tall order, so let's get with it. Evolution as a word means to unfold, to unroll, or to develop. It's not a bad word, actually. You can speak of the evolution of a culture, you can speak of the evolution of a people, you can speak of the evolution of a curriculum in schools. It's not a bad word at all. It simply is a word that means to develop something, to unroll something or unfold something, an idea even, the evolution of an idea. So as a word itself, it's not bad. But the way it's being used by modern scientists, in absolutely unscientific process to begin with, the way it's used today is quite different. George Kirkut, who was a militant atheist and evolutionist, wrote a book in 1965 called The Implications of Evolution. And he gave the definition of organic evolution there. And actually, I've never seen one better or different than this, so I'm using his even though it's dated 1965. He says, there is a theory which states that many living things, and also plants, I put that there, can be observed over the course of time to undergo changes so that new species are formed. This can be called the special theory of evolution. How many of you remember when you heard a couple years ago about cockapoo dogs? Remember that at all? That's Cocker Spaniel and Poodle. They're crossbred and it formed a new species we didn't have in the world before. I'm going to show you some others of those in just a couple moments too. Navel oranges, Charolais cattle, all sorts of things. Anybody plant G90 corn, sweet corn? How about peaches and cream, sweet corn? You know what that is, don't you? Well, G90 is a variety that's bred up north, but it's a variety that does the same thing. It's a mixture of yellow and white corn, and that's an interbred, or that's a crossbreeding or selective breeding experiments that brought that new kind of corn into existence. That's in perfect harmony with anything the Bible teaches. That's not out of harmony at all. Anything you believe or I believe. When we say in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and created all animal life and all plant life and all human life. That's not out of harmony at all. On the other hand, he continues, there's the theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. This theory can be called the general theory of evolution. The general theory of evolution is quite different. The organic evolution, macroevolution, general evolution, those are terms that this theory is known by. And that's the one that I oppose, and that's the one that does not occur. So let me try to help you understand the difference between the two. Special or microevolution occurs all the time. Now you're going to have some in classrooms in school that are going to tell your children or your grandchildren that evolution occurs all the time. Well, one type of evolution does. It occurs all the time. But you can't use that as evidence for the other kind of evolution, which is done also. Selective breeding occurs all the time. Adaptation to environment. Did you know that people who live near the equator have thinner skins than people who live in the North Pole district or the South Pole district? They have thicker skins rather. That's because of adaptation to an environment. Genetic pooling is such that sometimes the pooling cycle in a gene form is such that, well, it either stops or it no longer can reproduce, that kind of thing. There's a certain kind of bird on one side of the Rocky Mountain range. The same bird on the other side of the Rocky Mountain range, they cannot reproduce if you crossbreed the two. As long as they stay on their own genetic side or their genetic pooling side, they're fine. They get mixed up, they cannot reproduce. That's genetic pooling. Perfect harmony with creation. Perfect harmony with Scripture. On the other hand, general macroevolution says this: simple life evolved from non-living matter. Complex life, including man, evolved from simple life forms. That's general evolution, that's macroevolution, that's organic evolution. Let me try to explain it to you this way. How many of you dug a little dirt in your yard recently? Done any of that? Yeah, you probably have, or if you haven't dug any, you've got some, don't you? Dirt, rocks, dirt, sand, probably has some of that. Well, over a period of time, long periods of time, this theory suggests that stuff like sand or rocks or dirt became living. At least there's some simple life form that was spontaneously generated. And that simple life form then, over a period of multiplied millions of years, complexified into a variety of different kinds of species, all of which are related, but they're all different kinds of species that find themselves in the tree of life. That's general or macroevolution. That did not occur. That did not occur. So let's take a look at them. Special or microevolution? Well, all these dogs came from a common ancestor. It was a dog, by the way, or dogs, two dogs that crossbred and had these dogs, but they all came from a common ancestor. And that's not out of harmonious creation at all. This is a liger. That's a cross between a lion and a tiger. But prior to this crossbreeding experiment, no such animals existed at all. Is this out of harmony with the Genesis account? No, because creation is after its own kind. This is cat kind. And this is perfectly in harmony with anything the Bible teaches. You have here a growler, cross between a grizzly bear and a polar bear. You have here a wolf dog, cross between a wolf and a dog of some sort. You have here a zonkey, cross between a zebra and a donkey. Again, this is horse kind or equine kind, and so they can crossbreed this way. And this is a zorus, cross between a zebra and a horse. No problem at all. This is the kind of evolution that occurs all the time. And there's no problem with this as far as the creation account or the biblical account is concerned. This is in perfect harmony with anything we know in the Bible. General or macroevolution says simple life evolved from non-living matter, complex life, including man, evolved from simple life forms, and there's a descent there from a common ancestor too. This is a reproduction of the so-called tree of life that appears in most biology textbooks. You'll notice that everything is on a different branch. In fact, you've got the occupants of the various branches are conceived as related. They all came from a common ancestor. They're all part of the same root, part of the same stock, but they're just on a different branch. So you're just a little differently organized than a scorpion, a lizard, a snake, maybe a Leland cypress tree. You're just on a different branch on the evolutionary tree, you see. And so you're related to all these others according to the evolutionists. And there's really no difference ultimately between you and the others except you evolved in a little different way. Now this may explain to you why people are so mixed up and muddle-headed on ethics and a lot of other things today. How many of you are farmers in the audience? Any farmers? David's a farmer. The rest of you aren't. This is a farming community. What's happened here? David, do you breed any stock?
Sure.
Okay. Did you ever take one of your, what do you breed? Cattle? Cattle. Did you ever take one of your cows to the front of the auditorium and have it confessed sin for breeding? Out in public?
Yeah.
You never have done that? Okay. Well, why don't we see anything wrong with that? Well, if we don't see anything wrong with that, and they're just on a little different branch of the tree than we are, what would be wrong with human beings doing exactly the same thing? There wouldn't be, you see. There couldn't be any sinful situation if we're just bunched together a little differently than a rock. We just happen to be living, and the rock is not. So that's the conception here with organic evolution or general evolution. Complex living beings originate from a simple living being, which in turn ultimately came from non-living matter. So consciousness evolved from non-living matter. You heard David talking about mind. Mental activity came from dead, inorganic matter like sand or dirt, given this conception, given this theory. Well, let's take a little further. Evidence for the one type of evolution, that's special or microevolution, which does happen all the time, cannot be used as evidence for macroevolution. But people are doing it all the time. The problem is the two types are not logically connected at all. The one type that says you can create peaches and cream corn is not evidence to say that you had some species, that simple life form that spontaneously was generated from non-living dirt eons ago. They aren't connected. They have no logical connection whatsoever. All right? Now here's some assumptions. Same writer, George Kirkut, spoke of assumptions that the evolutionists make. And he's a committed atheist, a committed evolutionist. But he says there are 7 basic assumptions that all evolutionists make. I'm going to mention the first 2. The first one is that non-living things gave rise to living material. That is, spontaneous generation occurred. Something started the whole process to bring living matter about. The second assumption is that spontaneous generation occurred only once. All of the 5 following that follow from the second one. Now he says, and listen to this, for the initial purposes of this discussion in evolution, I shall consider that the supporters of the theory of evolution hold that all these 7 assumptions are valid, and that these assumptions form the general theory of evolution, or macroevolution. The first point I should like to make, and listen, this man's a committed evolutionist. The first point I'd like to make is that these 7 assumptions, by their nature, are not capable of experimental verification. That means they're not science. Science deals with what already exists. It never tells you, please understand this, science never tells you how the apple that fell from the tree and hit Isaac Newton supposedly on the head got here. How the tree got here. Origins are singular events. They cannot be reproduced. They cannot be studied in laboratory conditions. There's no scientific theory for origins. The origin of first life, the origin of new life forms, and the origin of the universe. It doesn't fit into science. It's philosophy and revelation. It's not scientific at all. Science deals with what exists, and it helps us to understand how the world operates. God created, just like God created the family, God also created science. When He told the first human pair to have dominion over all things in the universe, He made scientific studies possible and mandatory. Here's why. Because you can't have dominion over things you don't understand. And in order to understand them, you have to kind of go out and experiment with things and find out how it works. When you find out how it works, then you have a way to be able to have dominion over those things. That's all about science. Well, this isn't science, so it doesn't belong in the science classroom at all. Never has, never will. Kirkut was excellent about pointing this out. There was one fellow who last taught at Harvard University. I think he's probably gone now, Richard Lewontin. He studied under one of the world's foremost evolutionists at Columbia University, but he had his doctorate from Harvard. He's an egghead, but he also said in one of his documents that, well, we don't hold to a naturalistic origin of the universe because it makes good sense and because it's based on the evidence and because the evidence is so overwhelming. We hold to these theories because we simply cannot allow a divine foot in the door. We can't make room for God. That's what they're telling you. And that's what he told you. Some of these people in their frank admissions at least will own up to these things. And that's good. I'm glad they do, because it helps us when they own up to the truth about why they actually hold these theories and why they try to teach these things to your kids and your grandkids. If you go into most universities in the country today, you will not find people who are creationists or theistic philosophers and so on getting tenure. You'll find them being denied tenure. They can't teach there because that would go against the liberal output or the liberal viewpoint of the school of which they're a member or which they're a faculty member. So these people are trying to maintain sort of a closed community and they don't want any room for God. We can't allow a divine foot in the door. Well, let me take you through to the basic argument against evolution. Evolutionists have steadfastly refused to make an argument. This material is going to be in the book on the chapter on the subject. There are two parts in the chapter on this subject. One is on human sexuality. I'm not going to go over that today. It's a little more complicated, but it is the knife in the throat for evolutionary theory. They will frankly admit they have no earthly explanation or idea how human sexuality evolved, how it's possible at all. And they'll frankly admit that. But I'm going to make the argument because they have simply refused to make it, so I'm going to make it for them. They won't like what I do with it, but I'm going to make it for them anyway. Here's the argument. If macroevolution is true, then each distinct characteristic of any or a human being, or each human being, must have been ultimately a product of evolution. That means that everything about you had to ultimately evolve if evolution is true. There can't be one single thing about you that didn't evolve if evolution is true. It all had to be a product of evolution. So this is obviously understandable. But it's false that each distinct characteristic of any or each human being is ultimately a product of macroevolution. Therefore, it's false that macroevolution is true. Now, distinct characteristics, what do I mean by those? The human eye. There are several distinct parts of the human eye, all of which have to work together in a fine fashion, or the eye doesn't work. The endocrine gland system, the complex information packets contained within human cells that program your cells to tell what kind of a living being you will be, what color your skin will be, how much hair or lack of it you have, how big you'll be, whether you're male or female. Those are complex information packets that are fit within the DNA molecule. Self-determinate consciousness in human beings, the cardiovascular system, the sexual reproductive system. I've got number 6, that's the cardiovascular system, and I'm going to show you that it's not a product of evolution, can't be. And I'll show you why in just a minute. Let me just go ahead and go through these real quickly. This is a human red blood cell. Now it's red because it has a product in it called hemoglobin that takes on oxygen and turns it red. Would you look at your hand or look at your veins in your hands? What color do they look to you? What color do they look?
Blue.
They look blue. How come they're not red? Well, because this is venous blood, and once the oxygen has been given off, the blood cells turn a purplish bluish color. That's what you're seeing. If you cut your hand or cut your finger and you bleed, what color is it, the blood, when the blood comes out? Is it blue? It's red. Why is it red? Because it hits the oxygen, and the oxygen is absorbed by the hemoglobin and turns it a crimson red color, the red blood cells. They live about 120 days. They're dying all the time. They're replaced by your bone marrow. And the bone marrow has to replace these every 120 days because the ones that you have now that are operating will die off. They feed and nourish with oxygen and food every single cell in your body. The bone cells, the muscle cells, the heart cells, the brain cells, all the other cells of the body are fed by and nourished by and given oxygen by the red blood cells. That's their function. This is the white blood cells responsible for fighting infection in your body. And all of us, of course, are familiar with that. You have sometimes an infection in your body, and you'll have, you squeeze it a little bit, and some of that yellow, icky stuff comes out. We call it pus. Well, that's the white blood cells that have rushed to that part of the body to help fight the infection off and to heal your body. That's what its function is all about. Here's a platelet. Platelets are responsible for clotting. If you did not have platelets, or the platelets are not functional, then you could cut yourself and you'll bleed to death. These are the little guys that will go around and clot your blood so that you don't bleed to death. The platelets. Now let's go back to the red blood cells again. Red blood cells are transported through the arteries to the various parts of the body. There are three vessels. I'll show you those three in a minute. This is an artery. An artery is a smooth, elastic kind of vessel. It has to be like a balloon, so to speak, because every time the heart beats, there's pressure. You find a blood pressure like 140 over 30. That's what low is in the diastolic time. 140 over 70, 128 over 67. Your high side is when the heart beats and the blood vessel expands. The low side is when the heart rests and the blood vessel goes back. It's like a balloon. It has to expand all the time. That's the arteries. And that's on the inside, there's an internal layer that's very, very smooth to facilitate the flow of blood through the arteries. The veins are a little different. The veins, after they go through the capillaries are thinner than a single human hair. And the capillaries wind in and out of all the various cells of the body. The amazing thing is, and I'll show you this in a couple of seconds, that the food and the oxygen actually go through the cell wall, or the wall of the capillaries, into the surrounding cells. They actually go right through the walls to the surrounding cells. And they pick up waste from those same cells and carry those waste back to be relieved or rid of in the body. The veins have little flaps in them. You see these little flaps? You got to point these up. Varicose veins, the flaps have quit working. Normal veins are like this because if you didn't have these flaps, that would prevent the blood from flowing downward, say for gravity. All the blood would pool at your ankles when you're standing. Because after the blood goes through the arteries and then through the capillaries, there's very, very little pressure left to get it back to the heart. So a combination of lower pressure in your diaphragm and your heart beating and so on, and some other things, contractions of your body's muscle cells and muscles, the blood actually gets back. But the flaps are closed to prevent that blood from slipping or going in the other direction in the veins. Now, this is what a capillary looks like. And you'll notice that there's a flow of the oxygen and the food to the various cells of the body. Picture these as being bone cells, or nerve cells, or muscle cells, or brain cells, or heart cells. I don't care what kind of cells they are. They're all fed oxygen and given food nutrients by virtue of the red blood cells. That's how. Did you ever hear the passage or read the passage in the scriptures that says life is in the blood? You know, God knew that a whole long time before any scientist ever figured that out. In fact, they used to bleed people in George Washington's day, and George Washington almost died from being bled. Because they thought that there was a problem with your health. If you were sick, you would bleed them and run all that bad stuff off. Let them bleed to death in order to heal them. That didn't help much. That was going in the opposite direction, wasn't it? Now, we all know, all the doctors know, and everybody else knows, life's in the blood. God told us that a long time, thousands of years ago. Well, that's because this is such an amazing system. You see the red blood cells here going, you see the white blood cells there too. They pick up carbon dioxide and other waste from the cells of the body, and they eliminate these. Some elimination is done through sweat. Some elimination is done through carbon dioxide that's breathed out through your lungs. Some elimination goes into the bladder, it's eliminated as urine. Some goes into the intestines, it's eliminated as excrement. You get rid of your waste products in any number of ways after the nutrients have been taken out of them and made use of by the body. But the way the body gets these nutrients is through the bloodstream, through the cardiovascular system. Now then, let's go on to another amazing thing, the heart. The heart is an incredible pump. Actually the lower, the ventricles do the pumping, but you'll notice this is blue blood because this is the venous blood, comes into the superior and inferior vena cavas to the upper chamber of the heart. Then the upper chamber, the blood goes down to the lower chamber. You see this flap right here? That flap closes so that the blood doesn't, when it's pumped, doesn't go back up to the upper chamber. Instead, it goes now to the lungs, where the blood receives its oxygen from the lungs. Then it comes back into the left auricle, and by the way, have you ever heard of mitral valve prolapse? Anybody have that disease? That means your mitral valve is not working too well. This valve also closes, and the blood now that's oxygenated from the lungs is pumped through the rest of the body, through the arteries. The blue blood and the red blood do not mix in our cardiovascular system. The heart is an amazing pump that beats some 40 million times a year. And not one of you ever sat down and said, I think I'll let my heart beat today. Did you? It's all automatic. This is an automatic process without which you can't live. It goes on day and night 40 million times a year. There are some 6,000 miles of vessels, arteries, capillaries, veins in your body. Some 6,000 miles in each of your bodies. And the heart process and the cardiovascular process is automatic. It goes on all the time. Now, that's amazing enough just to look at this, to understand this would be very difficult to explain on evolutionary, slow, multiplied millions of years of time so that these things evolve a little bit at a time from one process to the other. Incredibly difficult to explain that. But we're not done yet, because the most amazing thing is this. Well, I was going to show you this first. Actually, I do need to mention this. These are the capillaries. Again, you can see the waste products there. The bluish blood after the oxygen's been given off and the food's been given off to the cells. In the lungs, this process is reversed. In the body, the oxygen and nutrients are given off to the cells that surround. Waste material is picked up, right? Everybody with me? In the lungs, the oxygen is given to the cells and the waste products are given off. It's exactly the opposite in the lungs as it is in the capillaries of the body. And you've got little grape-like sacs called alveoli in your lungs. That's where the capillaries are found. That's where they are wound inside these little grape-like sacs. The oxygen goes in there, goes into the capillaries, and gets sent out to the rest of the body. Now, smokers or people who have emphysema have those little grape-like sacs full of stuff that won't allow that process to take place, and so they slowly suffocate to death. That's why. That's the reason. But that goes on day and night forever, and you don't think about it. When you're sleeping, that's still going on, and you're not even thinking about it in bed. You're just out. You're out like a light. You're not thinking of anything but getting a rest unless you dream. All right, this is the most amazing thing. This is the diagram of blood flow in an unborn baby, a fetus, inside its mama's tummy. The mama is doing the breathing, the mama is doing the oxygenation of the blood, the nutrients that are fed to the baby, for the baby. The blood comes through the umbilical vein and goes on up to the heart. Now I want you to notice something. The red and blue blood is not separated in fetal life. In fact, it's separated in mother's life, but not in fetal life. There are a series of little detours that are existent in fetal life that are non-existent once the baby is born. This is called a ductus venosus. This detours the main flow of the blood away from the liver because the liver can't handle the blood in this stage. And so it takes the main flow of the blood and detours it around the liver and sends only the amount the liver can actually use at this time. When the blood goes to the heart, there's no need to keep the blood separated in the heart like it is in adult life. Blue blood, red blood. So there's a hole right through the middle of the heart called the foramen ovale. The blood goes straight through the heart. The flaps are non-operational. You know when the doctor listens to your heartbeat, he hears something like, a little bit like this, lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. That's because he hears the flaps closing. That's what he actually hears in the stethoscope. With the baby's heartbeat, he doesn't hear lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub because the flaps don't work. What he hears is swish, 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 swish. A little different sound. It's altogether different. You have here, because the lungs aren't operational, so the baby's not doing its own breathing, there's a ductus arteriosus to take the main flow of the blood away from the lungs, because it doesn't all have to go to the lungs in fetal life, and so it's detoured away from that. The hypogastric arteries take the blood and return it to the umbilical cord, where it's returned to the mother for its next trip through the body. Incredible. Here's what happens. Here's what happens. When the baby is born and takes the first breath, everything changes. Instantly. The ductus venosus is clamped shut. It's never used again. The ductus arteriosus is clamped shut. It's never used again, because now all the blood has to go to the lungs, because the baby is doing its own breathing. The heart flap, it was opened through the heart that kept the blood going through the heart in all different directions. It's now closed. After the 10th day, it's supposed to be sealed shut. If it's not, you have a situation known as blue baby. But the foramen ovale closes and seals shut after the 10th day. But it's closed at birth when the baby takes its first breath. These flaps begin to operate. The hypogastric arteries are clamped shut. They're never used again. They form round ligaments to support your lower body parts. This all happens in an instant. It happens like this. When the baby takes its first breath. And it's always got to work first time every time. Or there's no life in that little infant that was just born by virtue of having been expelled from its mother's body. Questions? Questions for the evolutionist. Unless the cardiovascular system works the first time every time, how would life have been possible? What would happen to the organism while the arteries are being developed from the elastic membranes into these elastic membranes that will accept the beating of the heart when the heart beats, instead of hard and non-elastic membranes like veins? What would happen to the human while the flaps would prevent blood from slipping downward or backward in the veins? It's being developed. It's in a partially developed stage. Evolutionists say we need millions of years. Well, what would happen if it's on year 25 with a 2 million year time frame and those flaps don't close? And they're not going to close for another 1.5 million years or better. How would life be possible at all? What would happen? What would be the result of either the ductus arteriosus or the ductus venosus had been in a preliminary stage of development? Suppose they don't close off when the baby is born. So now the blood is detoured past the lungs, never gets there, at least a good portion of it. Suppose the other blood is detoured past the liver needs all of it, but the liver can't have all of it because there's that detour still working. What would happen? Would life be possible at all? Would life in the fetus happen? What would occur in the various detours of prenatal life if they're developing and they don't close off? Would life have been possible? How about this? Well, what have we learned? Well, initially we've learned this. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. The body has design and therefore a designer. Let me ask you a question or two. If you have information, what do you have? What's required to have information? An informer? If you have communications, what's required to have communication? Communicate. If you have poetry, what's required to have poetry? Poetry. If you have a composition, a musical composition, or an English composition, what's required to have a composition? If you have design, what's required to have design? Designer. You've just given a good argument for the fact that psalmist would say we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and indeed we are. Life is not an unguided accident as macroevolution teaches. Not at all. Now then, let's look at a few other things. What would happen to such organisms during the developmental stages of the foramen ovale? Remember, the blue blood and the red blood are separated into the right side and left side of the hearts. They don't mix. Well, what would happen if that flap doesn't close? Would the organism exist first as blue baby, then blue child, and finally blue adult? Blue babies don't live. How would life have been possible under these circumstances? What would happen, since red blood cells carry food and oxygen to all the other cells, How would the nerve cells, muscle cells, bone cells, brain cells, heart cells, how would they work if they're not getting, because the red blood cells aren't able to do their job just yet? They're still being developed evolutionarily. So since they aren't fully developed and they can't do their job, how would the rest of the nerve cells and the bone cells and the muscle cells, how would they be functioning at all? How would they be fed at all? How would they receive oxygen at all? They wouldn't. Since the red blood cells live about 120 days, since the bone marrow generates new ones to take place of the old ones, let's suppose the bone marrow is still being developed by evolutionary means. How would the red blood cells be developed to replace the ones that die off? And if you have no more red blood cells, then how does the organism live? See, this is a system that has to work. It works together. It is a complex system that works together. Evolutionists call these evolutionary novelties. It's a fancy expression. Evolutionary novelties. The eye is an evolutionary novelty because it has several parts. All of them have to work together or the eye doesn't work. That's an evolutionary novelty. Well, the cardiovascular system is an evolutionary. In fact, you are one big evolutionary novelty. You have several different things in your body that have complex parts, all of which have to work together and function perfectly, or life does not exist in you. Well, indeed, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. God said that in Psalm 139, verse 14. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Now, I've got 20 minutes. Well, I don't have 20 minutes. I have about 10, maybe 15 notes. I'm not going to give you that time back unless I need to. What I'd like to do is, if you have questions, I'd like to be able to try to answer some of those questions for you. This is complicated, and I know that. But at the same time, it's good because it proves to us that evolution could not have occurred, and since a naturalistic explanation for the universe is impossible, there's only one left, a supernaturalistic evolution, supernaturalistic production for the universe. And the Bible is absolutely correct when it says, in the beginning, and you can finish it, God, say it, created the heavens and the earth. That's exactly what happened. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God, and without Him was not anything made that hath been made. In fact, according to Scripture, the Word, which is Jesus, the Word which became flesh, He is the creator of all that exists other than Himself. He had a hand in the creative process, Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 and following. And, but we wouldn't know that unless we had good solid evidence to prove it. And we do. We have perfectly solid evidence to prove that. So, well, I'm done. I said I'd give you a couple minutes back. If you want the time, you can have it. But if you'd like to ask a question or two, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Any questions from anybody? Okay. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. By the way, the Preacher's Files, David started to tell you a little bit about it. I've been kind of conspicuously absent as of late, but I was there pretty much from the beginning. Preacher's Files is an internet work, but it has a sermon outlines, it has Bible studies, it has also a lot of other things on there, like blogs that a lot of people can use in various congregations. They can have their own website at various congregations for $20 a month and put up a website that's developed for them. You can have also the Preacher's File Forum, which is a series of questions asked by people who get on the forum and want to have a Bible study, and they have a certain issue they want to explore, and so they explore that issue with good, talented teachers who are able to help them through those issues. Marvelous work. That's the Preacher's Files. It would encourage you, if you have a website and you have a computer, to go ahead and log on to preachersfiles.com. .com. It is a .com. Okay. Sometimes it's .net, sometimes .org.com, and take a look around and see what it's all about. And that's the ones who are, at least in part, responsible for this lecture program. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.